America's geography. It's perfect, right? An island fortress with vast oceans on either side, total mastery of its neighborhood, secure from nearly any conceivable threat. Well, what if I told you that its armor does have some chinks, and that if you wanted to decimate American power, this is how you do it?
About 100 miles from Florida tonight, 4 Russian warships steaming into Havana Bay, including a nuclear-powered submarine.
The U.S. sending warships and aircraft to keep an eye on a convoy of Russian vessels over in the Caribbean Sea.
The visiting Russian warships to Cuba are Vladimir Putin's way of reminding President Biden that Moscow can challenge Washington in its own sphere of influence, too.
Nearly 70% of US trade relies on maritime routes, making the economy highly dependent on stable waterways. But what gives the US such an advantage? Well, the gods of hydrology have blessed America with the greater Mississippi Basin, a network of navigable waterways larger than any other on Earth. How does this shape US power? Connecting 6 major rivers, the Mississippi, Missouri, Arkansas, Red, Ohio, and Tennessee. This system forms the skeleton of America's economic and geopolitical strength. What's more, this vast network overlays the largest contiguous farmland in the world, making the Midwest an agricultural and transport powerhouse. Shipping goods by water is 10 to 30 times cheaper than by land, allowing raw materials, produce, and goods to flow seamlessly from America's interior to the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf acts then as a gateway, linking this internal network to global markets, enabling the US to project its economic strength far beyond its borders, securing the US a unique position of power via this awesome hydrological chain. Geopolitical theorist Nicholas Spikeman famously dubs the Caribbean the American Mediterranean, essential to US influence and security just as the Med was to Rome. The Gulf of Mexico is the core, not only supplying 14% of US crude oil and 5% of natural gas, but also processing over 48% of petroleum and 51% of natural gas on its coast. With 4 of America's 5 largest ports along its shores, the Gulf sustains US energy independence and global trade dominance. But could this incredible system also hide an Achilles heel? When the hydrology gods dipped America in their sacred waters, they missed one crucial spot. This gateway, the vital connection between the nation's river-fed economic power and the wider world, is also its greatest vulnerability. If disrupted, this single point could halt the entire system, making America's strength suddenly fragile. That heel? Cuba. Just 90 miles from Florida, Cuba's positioned near 2 vital choke points, one by the Florida Keys and the other leading into the Gulf of Mexico, makes it strategically indispensable. A hostile presence on the island could monitor, disrupt, or even block US shipping routes, directly affecting the Gulf and the Mississippi River Basin, key arteries of the US economy. Freight from major ports like South Louisiana, Corpus Christi, Beaumont, and Houston must pass through these choke points, controlled by Havana to reach its destinations. Even a single day's disruption of Mississippi River traffic could cost the US over $300 million, highlighting the importance of Cuban stability to America's security and prosperity.
Russian military drills begin in the Caribbean nation for the first time in 16 years. This military exercise is a clear provocation that the Pentagon is seeking to downplay.
Under Spanish rule, Cuba was a strategic hub for military campaigns and trade routes, linking the riches of the New World to Europe, a fact well known to pirates and foreign powers who frequently targeted the island. It's no coincidence that in 1898, Americans' first overseas expeditionary conflict, the Spanish-American War, was aimed at taking control of Cuba, effectively turning it into a de facto US territory. At the end of World War II, it looked like game over in the American Mediterranean. The US had forced the British out of their Caribbean bases, trading them with mothballed warships to fight Hitler's Kriegsmarine, and even bought the Virgin Islands from Denmark to preempt any German attempt to establish a U-boat base near America's heartland. But then, in 1959, everything changed. Cuba underwent a revolution, ousting the US-backed government and aligning with America's arch-nemesis, the Soviet Union. In a dramatic twist, what the US had viewed as a secure outpost now became a base for Soviet influence and missiles, a dagger pointed at America's most vulnerable point.
Fidel Castro, who came to power on a wave of personal popularity, has allowed himself to become dominated by Russia. Her support now constitutes a threat to Western security. Russian missile bases less than 100 miles from the United States. President Kennedy's dramatic retaliation underlines the gravity of this threat. Announcing the blockade to prevent further build-up of Soviet strength, he added that further action may be justified.
The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 underscored the critical threat Cuba poses when aligned with a foreign adversary. With Soviet nuclear missiles installed on the island, major US cities, Washington, D.C., New York, even Chicago, suddenly lay within minutes of a strike. This proximity was intolerable for US security, leading President Kennedy to impose a naval blockade and demand their removal, bringing the superpowers to the brink of nuclear war. But Cuba isn't the only choke point critical to US security and supply chains in the region. Another influential strategist, Alfred Thayer Mahan, argued that, uniquely positioned between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, the US had the potential for dominance but needed key advantages to secure it. For Mahan, controlling strategic points in the Caribbean, especially Cuba and Panama, was essential. He foresaw that a canal network in Central America would be vital for quickly moving naval forces between oceans, enabling the US to project power globally. The construction of the Panama Canal in 1914 culminated a centuries-old vision, tracing back to 1534, when Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, ordered a survey for a canal route across the Isthmus of Panama. The Spanish sought a shortcut to link Spain and Peru, hoping to gain a military advantage over their Portuguese rivals. While this early effort remained only a vision, the canal idea persisted for centuries. The French took on the challenge in the late 19th century, but faced devastating obstacles, from engineering issues to tropical diseases, that led to a costly and ultimately failed attempt. Recognizing the canal's strategic potential, the United States stepped in, supporting Panama's independence from Colombia in 1903 to secure the rights to build and control the canal. Completed in 1914, the Panama Canal fulfilled Alfred Thayer Mahan's vision by linking the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, allowing the U.S. to rapidly mobilize naval forces across oceans.
Panama Canal, 22 years ago. In the distance now, the lines of tracks are to be seen, and also one gets an idea of the width of the canal. Originally specified to be 200 feet in width at the bottom, President Roosevelt, TR that was, ordered the dimensions changed to 300 feet, costing the United States an extra $13 million, and well worth it.
Today, the Panama Canal remains an economic powerhouse. By linking the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, the canal cuts thousands of miles off shipping routes, saving time and fuel, translating to billions in global trade savings annually. It's a lifeline for everything from electronics to energy supplies, with nearly 40% of US container traffic passing through its locks. For the US, the canal means faster, cheaper access to markets across Asia and Europe, boosting American exports and cementing the country's role as a global trade leader. Yes, another hydrological ace up America's sleeve. However, while once essential to US military strategy, the Panama Canal's role has faded significantly. During World Wars I and II and Vietnam, the canal allowed the US to move ships and supplies between oceans quickly, with almost 90% of ammunition for Vietnam arriving via the canal. But today, most of the Navy's carriers are too large to pass through, and the Army no longer considers the canal a reliable supply route in global conflicts. The canal's vulnerability is also a concern. Its locks and dams are easy targets, with Gatun Dam especially at risk, as even a small conventional explosive could take it offline for years. Compounding these issues are climate challenges. The canal needs 60 million gallons of water daily to operate, relying on predictable rainfall.
Without enough water to raise and lower vessels through the locks, officials were left with no alternative but to cut operations, creating headaches for shipping worldwide. Hydrologist Abelardo Val says new water sources are essential to maintaining the canal's profitability.
Despite a planned $2 billion US military project to address these water issues, it has yet to start, making the canal increasingly unreliable for military use. But while the Panama Canal may be too narrow for aircraft carrier strike groups, it remains a critical artery for US military logistics, supporting key allies in Asia like South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan with essential oil and gas supplies. In a Pacific conflict with China, disruptions to the canal would threaten fuel and resource flow to these allies, undermining US readiness and influence in the region. This lifeline is vulnerable, and Beijing has noticed.
China says it has fired an intercontinental ballistic missile into the Pacific Ocean. Now, this is Beijing's first such test in over 40 years.
Over the past year, China has aggressively expanded its presence in Central America, moving beyond its traditional footholds in South America and establishing gaining influence right on Washington's doorstep. In countries like Nicaragua, Honduras, and El Salvador, Chinese companies are securing control over infrastructure, telecommunications, logistics, and even security, shifting the power balance in America's backyard. This shift happened fast. Countries like Panama, El Salvador, and Honduras switched diplomatic ties from Taiwan to China, opening the region to Chinese investment in ports, digital networks, and dual-use infrastructure. In Nicaragua, Chinese firms are developing roads, ports, and a potential rail line stretching from the Pacific to the Caribbean. The result is a pro-China corridor across Central America, connecting both coasts and placing Beijing at the heart of the Americas, in a rerun of what Mahan wanted for America. This corridor challenges US influence in a region Washington has historically dominated. It also gives China, and potentially allies like Russia and Iran, unprecedented proximity to US shores, bypassing the US-controlled Panama Canal and establishing pathways that could support anti-US operations in the Caribbean. America's rivals appear to be setting up right where it matters most, close to home and close to vital strategic points. There have been setbacks for China's plans for a rival to the Panama Canal. Nearly a decade ago, China backed a $50 billion, 172-mile canal through Nicaragua, crossing from the Caribbean to the Pacific. Though promoted as an economic boost, critics highlighted environmental risks, forced displacements, and financial issues. The project faced fierce opposition from thousands of Nicaraguan farmers who protested land seizures, only to face government repression. Ultimately, the 2014 groundbreaking remained symbolic. No substantial work was completed, and the Chinese concession was eventually cancelled. Yet, this idea of a Panama Canal alternative underscores China's intent to secure strategic footholds in Central America, challenging the US's historical dominance. Had it materialized, the Nicaragua Canal would have bypassed the US-controlled Panama Canal, providing China and its allies with an independent route through the Americas. This ambitious shift would place China even closer to Washington's doorstep. Interestingly, from 1912 to 1933, the US occupied Nicaragua, officially to promote democracy, but with the underlying aim of preventing foreign powers from building a canal that could compete with the Panama Canal. And it's not just China challenging US dominance close to home. Russia is also expanding its influence, using Venezuela as a base. In December, 2 nuclear-capable Russian Tu-160 bombers flew to Venezuela, their third visit since 2008, signaling deeper ties between embattled President Nicolás Maduro and Russian President Vladimir Putin. For Washington, these moves go beyond symbolism. While Venezuela lacks Cuba's strategic weight, as it doesn't straddle major shipping bottlenecks, it's still a potential threat, especially near the Panama Canal. A permanent Russian military presence there would violate the 1962 Kennedy-Khrushchev understanding of nuclear forces in the region and could spark a crisis reminiscent of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And speaking of Cuba, Russian warships have recently docked in Cuban ports, and the island has even applied for BRICS partnership, signaling a shift towards deeper ties with US rivals once again. So there we have it, the US's greatest strength. The vast waterways blessed by the hydrology gods in the American Mediterranean is also its greatest vulnerability. As global power competition intensifies in Eurasia and Africa, the Caribbean is emerging as the next frontier, with countries like Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela squarely in the geopolitical spotlight. Maybe it's time for Langley to start scouting salsa clubs for its next recruits.